We're starting a new class on the book of Daniel. Good to have the Kaufmans back here with us. Good time to start back, being back in town, because we're starting new material tonight. So go ahead and turn your Bible to the book of Daniel. How many of you have read through the book of Daniel at some point? Most of you kind of know what it's about. It's a fascinating book. Just a lot that we can learn from this study, from this book. And I'm very, very excited about the class. Let's talk about, since many of you are familiar with Daniel, what would you say some of the major themes of the book are? Kind of go back in your mind and jog your memory. What are some of the big things that stick out about the book of Daniel? The prophecies, yeah. A lot of prophecies, a lot of visions. Very fascinating because Daniel foretells things that are going to happen hundreds of years in the future as he writes. And you see God working in Daniel in that way. And we're going to see a lot of prophecy. We'll see a lot of that. Other thoughts? Tina? Yeah. Daniel does what God wants. No matter where he's at, what's going on, Daniel is a faithful servant of God. What a great example for us. And not only Daniel, but we probably know them best as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, although that was not the names they started out with, as we'll see tonight. Great examples for us. What else comes to mind as you look through Daniel? Yeah. He was a very disciplined person. He was a very learned person. He was he stuck to it, as you said. He was faithful to the Lord. One of the things that came to my mind reading through the book again was that you really see strongly that God is in control. God is in control of nations and of kings. And you think that's still true today? Is God in control? Oh, yes, he is. Even though sometimes we look at the world around us, as I'm sure the people back then did, and said, well, I have some doubts. Is God really in control? And we have those doubts sometimes that arise, but of course we can't see the whole picture that God is putting together. But God is in control even when things may not seem that way to us. Other thoughts or comments you have on the themes of Daniel? One of the major themes too, then this goes back to Bob's earlier comment about prophecy. You see very strongly that God is going to establish his eternal kingdom. We're going to get right into that in chapter 2, probably next week or the week after, that there are these other kingdoms coming that God is going to set up, but the main thing is that God is going to set up his eternal kingdom, and it will never fade away. It will never perish. So that should be very encouraging to us. So I like the mix of the stories of the life of Daniel and of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I like the prophecy. I like the history that we're going to learn in this class. And so I hope and pray that it'll be a profitable study for you. Well, let's kind of zoom out for a minute and let's think about where are we in terms of the whole of the Old Testament. Where does Daniel fit into things? So I had to cut off some of this timeline because I don't know if you can read it as it is, but I try to make it as big as possible. Notice, though, that this here we have the United Kingdom era. And of course, that's a reference to, oh, you see in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, like Charles has taken us through portions of that in the life of David. The kingdom of Israel was united. And we had Samuel, we had King Saul as the first king, we had King David and King Solomon. But shortly thereafter, what happened? After King Solomon's time, the kingdom divided. Do you remember how it divided? North and south, right? How many tribes were in the north? Is this familiar to you all? 10 in the north, right? And we had Judah in the south. The north was called Israel, the south was called Judah. So we had this divided kingdom era. Now, notice where we are here. We're about 800 BC. And I'm going to go to the next slide, and it's just going to kind of shift over. The timeline's going to shift. So here, we're about 700 BC. We're still in the divided kingdom era. And I put three boxes here around some important events in Old Testament history. Do you remember what happened to the northern 10 tribes? They did not have one good king. They kept going further and further into sin and into idolatry. And of course, God was sending prophets, and God was warning, and God was saying, turn away from your wickedness, come back to me and serve me. And he's warning them, but they would not listen. They had wicked king after wicked king, and the people were wicked, following those kings. And so what happened to them? Anyone remember? God sent another nation, another kingdom, to wipe them out, take them over, take them into captivity. And that was the end of the northern 10 tribes. You remember who took them over? The Assyrians, yeah, the Assyrians. And so this was 722 BC. And Judah, the southern kingdom, continued on. Judah had some good kings. You remember King Josiah as an example, who reformed the nation and brought them back to, they found the book of the law and they started trying to practice it again. And they had some very wicked kings as well. You remember Manasseh, who came before Josiah. Manasseh was exceedingly wicked. And in fact, the Bible says that Josiah turned a lot of things around as king, but God says to them basically, I'm still going to punish you because what Manasseh did was so bad that I'm not going to forget. And God told Josiah, because you have followed me as a king, I'm not going to let it happen in your days, but the punishment is still coming. Manasseh shed much innocent blood. Manasseh sacrificed his children to the false gods. Manasseh was a horrible king and a horrible person, and God says because of that, judgment is coming. And so, this is in 2 Kings 24, thereabouts, where we start to link up in time with the book of Daniel. There was a king named Eliakim, who was the son of Josiah. Pharaoh Necho came along and changed his name to Jehoiakim, and he was a wicked king. But Nebuchadnezzar, anyone remember Nebuchadnezzar? Who was he the leader of? Remember? Babylon, yeah, the Babylonians. He comes along and comes against Judah, comes against Jerusalem. And there were 3 waves of attack. In 605 or thereabouts, Nebuchadnezzar comes and he takes away some of the people of Jerusalem. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are included in that group. He takes away some of the items from the temple of God. And he comes back again in a second wave in 597 BC And then again in 586 BC, Jerusalem falls, the temple is destroyed. God had told them, because of your wickedness, I'm going to wipe Jerusalem like a dish and turn it upside down, and everyone who hears about it, their ears are going to tingle. And when you hear about it, the things that went on, it makes your ears tingle, because it was horrible. But again, God was trying to get them to turn around. God was patient. God was warning. God was pleading with them, but they wouldn't turn around. And so they go into exile in Babylon for how long? God told them, right, how long it was going to be. How long were they in Babylon? I know I'm stretching your memory. You probably haven't thought about these things in a while. 70 years they're in Babylon. And this is the time of Daniel, when Daniel is prophesying. Daniel, like I mentioned, he's one of these that gets carried off because he's wise, he's well educated, he's healthy, and all. We'll see all that in chapter 1. And so he goes off to be forced to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. So that's sort of the background and the history that we're dealing with. Here's the 70-year period where they're in exile in Babylon. And then they come back. They're allowed to come back by the Persian king that comes along. And this is where we get the books of Ezra, Nehemiah. Esther takes place in this time period. They come back, they rebuild the temple, they rebuild the wall. And so that's where we are in the grand scheme of Old Testament history. Here's a map that may be helpful to you. This is Jerusalem over here. And this line, I have no idea what color this is, but you fill in the blank. Green. The green line, thank you, is the Assyrian captivity when the northern tribes were carried off to Assyria. And they never came back. The Assyrians actually sent people from this region back over into Israel to intermarry, and they were just wiped out. That was the end of the 10 tribes. And then, as we saw on the timeline, later in 586, the Babylonians, who took over the Assyrians, they come in and they destroy Jerusalem, and they ship the people over to Babylon, which was the world power of the time. King Nebuchadnezzar was amazingly powerful. As the Bible says, he was the king of kings. He overtook other kings and other nations. So this was a big deal. And it was a big deal that Daniel and his friends were serving in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. So that's where we are. Questions or comments on any of this? Anybody recognize the statue? Maybe that's what it looked like. I do like this background here that I found online, and a representation of the statue that was in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar that we'll see in chapter 2. But I'll leave this up for you. Let's get into chapter 1. And let me just read the first few verses here. Daniel 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names to them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So verse 1 is packed with a lot of meaning, and we just covered a lot of that in what we said earlier. But you see there, Jehoiakim was the king. Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon. He comes and besieges it. Notice in verse 2 how this is phrased. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Did Nebuchadnezzar, was it his power and was it his doing that he was able to take over Judah? No. We get one of the major themes already. We're starting to see it. The Lord gave Jerusalem into his hand. It was the Lord's doing. The Lord is in control. Would the Lord do that? Would the Lord punish his own people in this way? Yes. Yes, he would, and he did. And it wasn't the first time that he did. And so the Lord is behind it. The Lord is the power behind all of this. So he brought some of the vessels from the house of God, from the temple. He brought them, he says, to the land of Shinar, which I think has really no bearing on us except just to note that that is where the Tower of Babel was in Genesis 11, many, many years before. We're in modern-day Iraq. Russ? Okay, good point. Babel is Babylon. It's the same Hebrew word. So there's a long history in this region, going way back to Genesis 10, Genesis 11. And this is, like I mentioned, this is modern-day Iraq. So the king ordered Ashpenaz, in verse 3, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including the royal family and the nobles. Why did they do this? Why did they take these kids, pretty young guys, and take them out of Jerusalem and bring them to Babylon? Yeah, Jerusalem was going to be. It wasn't quite at this point. This was in the first stage of the siege, but it was to weaken the captured country and to strengthen the captor's country. It was pretty smart, really. They took the best and the brightest and brought them to serve in the king's court. We see in verse 6, we see their Hebrew names: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These names have a lot of meaning in Hebrew. Daniel, his name means God is my judge. Hananiah, the Lord is gracious. Mishael, who is what God is what his name means. And Azariah, the Lord has helped. But you notice that Nebuchadnezzar, actually the commander of the officials, in verse 7, he assigns new names to them. Now, these names are harder to pin down as to what exactly they mean, because it's in, is it Akkadian, Russ? I think it's in Akkadian language, or the language of the Babylonians. But they're references to the false gods of Babylon. They're changing their names to have to do with the true God, to the names of the idols in that area. And then we get to verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. I love what it says here in verse 8. Daniel made up his mind. You know, Daniel was probably a teenager at this point. He's a young man. And yet you see his strong dedication to the Lord. And he made up his mind. I am not going to defile myself with this food from the king. What a great example for us. We're going to have to make up our mind, aren't we? Whether we're going to defile ourselves with the things of the culture around us. And if we don't make up our mind, what's likely to happen? What if you're just kind of winging it and you haven't really made up your mind that you're going to serve the Lord? What's going to happen? You'll be led astray. When you get in the heat of the moment, when you're tempted with something, when you're tempted to defile yourself with the culture around you, that's not the time to try to be deciding what you're going to do, right? We need to make up our mind before this happens, that I am going to serve the Lord, no matter what. I'm going to serve the Lord. He had set it in his heart to do this. Now, how much pressure do you think there was on Daniel? Here's a young man. He's inexperienced in life. He's in the king's court, the king of the known world. How much pressure do you think is on this young man to do what he's not supposed to do? How easy would it have been for him to defile himself and to just cave in? Who's going to know? We're in this foreign country anyway, and maybe he would say, well, I don't even know if God is with us anymore, so I'm just going to fit in. I'm just going to go along with this. So you begin to see the great character of Daniel, the strength of Daniel, even as a young man. And that should be encouragement for us too, that this is what we must do. We've got to make up our minds who we're going to serve. We've got to make up our minds whether we're going to be carried away by the things around us. And if we'll do that, God will show us his favor. He will have his eyes upon us if we'll choose in our heart to serve him. God will he will dwell in us. He will walk among us. He will be our God. He will be our Father. If we will just choose in our heart that I'm going to follow him no matter what. I was just thinking of the sermon from Sunday in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. These are the promises of God. I'll be your God. You'll be my people. I'll be a father to you. You'll be my children. But you've got to be separate from the culture around you. And that's what Daniel is doing. And I think it's implied here, as we'll see later on, that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, they made that choice too. Questions or thoughts that you have? Bob.
I can see where Daniel was blessed. He was blessed by those who do not compromise.
Yeah.
Down and have to try.
Yeah.
And that's
He's an impressive guy, isn't he?
And he never compromised.
Yeah.
What the world wants us to do is compromise our identity,
Right.
our values.
Right. He never compromised. He stood fast with the Lord. And you see the Lord blessing and blessing and blessing him just over and over again as we go through the story. Other thoughts or comments? Tina.
We see them using discernment because they accept the education, they seem to accept the name change, they will accept working for the king, but there are certain things they're not willing to do.
That's a great point. They accept the name change. They accept working in the king's palace, whatever you want to call it. They're accepting the learning. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. The learning that they're getting about the Babylonian culture and so on. And so there's great discernment here. It's a great point that there's a line here that I will not cross. I'll do all of this, but I won't cross this line, and I won't defile myself with the king's food. By the way, what was it about the king's food that would defile them? Yeah, it's likely sacrifice to idols, or the meals might have been tied up in idolatry. What did you say, Myra? Same thing, yeah. And it could have been that these were foods, well, such as pork, as an example, that the people of God were told not to eat. And so Daniel doesn't eat it. Look at verse 9. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. I think to Russ's point earlier, they also show great discernment when Daniel says, okay, I'm not crossing this line. Now, how do you handle that? He could have come out with guns blazing right away, right? And I'm not doing this. You can't make me do this. And I don't know, maybe there's a time for that. But that's not how Daniel handles it. What does he do? He goes to the official in verse 8, the end of verse 8, and he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He takes a very reasonable approach. Would you let me do this? Would you allow me to not eat this food? And the commander reluctantly, after some convincing, he agrees to this. And it says in verse 9 that God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. So one of the great themes of Daniel, of course, is God working in nations. But here we see, too, that God works in the lives of individuals. He works in the lives of his people. And he saw to it that the commander would grant him this request, because the Lord, again, his eyes are on Daniel. And his eyes are on Daniel because Daniel wants to serve the Lord. So, as we read, the commander is reluctant. He basically says, you all are going to look haggard and unhealthy if I let you do this. Daniel says, again, showing a lot of discretion and wisdom, let's just try it for 10 days. Let's just try it and see what happens. And of course, what happened? They were healthier than all of the other men. The appearance was observed after 10 days. In verse 14, the commander listens. Look at verse 15. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. I think verse 17 is very interesting. Because what did God give them knowledge of? Every branch of literature. right? Every branch of literature and wisdom. And to Daniel, he even gave the ability to understand dreams and visions. So they're learning the Babylonian history and literature and culture and mythology and all of this. And God is allowing them to learn all of these things. And I think there's maybe a point there to be made carefully, that we too can study the knowledge of man, the wisdom of man, the thinking of man, and we can use that wisdom. You have to do it carefully, though, don't you? You don't want to get caught up in all of this stuff. But God here has granted them knowledge of every branch of literature and wisdom. And it made me think, too, about our education system, which, of course, tries to write God out of everything. No reference to God or anything. And you can't really have true wisdom or knowledge that way, even about the, math and science and literature and all of these things. It's really, we need to tie all of those things to God because He's the source of all knowledge, even this sort of wisdom of man. He's the one that can provide that. Look at verse 18. Then at the end of the days which the king specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's personal service. That must have been a big deal, to enter the king's personal servant. And he's the king of the world at this time. Verse 20, as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. Again, God provided them with this knowledge and understanding and wisdom. God is smiling upon them. God is protecting them. God is helping them. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. So Daniel, the point in verse 21 is that he lasted all through the Babylonian Empire until Cyrus comes into power. Cyrus was a Persian. He was not a Babylonian. And we learn in chapter 10, by the way, in verse 1, that Daniel lived a little bit longer than this even. But the point that's being made in verse 21 is that Daniel was blessed by God. Daniel hung in there even as empires rise and fall. Daniel sees all of this, and he's there all the way through to the end of the Babylonian Empire. And, I wonder if he saw the time when the Israelites got to come back home, but I don't think that he did, based on what I've seen. He probably died shortly before then, but I'm not positive about that. Any questions or comments? Right. That's a great question. Yeah. Were there others? How did they react? I'm sure there were others. Did they compromise? It was Daniel and these other three, were they a light to these other men? Great question. Jim. Yeah.
And what does God do? By doing that, those people get elevated within the enemy society, and they go on to convert the country to the one true God.
Yes, isn't that amazing? That's a nice way to put it in a nutshell. Yeah, the Babylonians were fairly smart. They did their share of death and destruction, no doubt. But they took the cream of the crop and they trained them and everything, educated them. And then we'll see Nebuchadnezzar becomes, in some sense, a believer in the one true God. And, Daniel and his associates, they had a big impact, no doubt, on all of that. And of course, we're going to see the stories as we go along. Daniel in the lion's den in chapter 6, the fiery furnace in chapter 3, and just amazing, amazing stories. Looking forward to that. So we are out of time. We'll start chapter 2 next week. Thank you all.